Hello, welcome to this presentation on a little introduction to level design, where I'm going to walk you through level design, what it means, some important terminology to know, and pretty much giving you a little start on how to wrap your head around level design as a discipline. So who am I? I'm Devin Wiersma. I'm a level designer at the Beans team working with Devolver Digital on a secret project. Previously, I worked at Ubisoft Toronto on Far Cry 6 and at a studio called Coco Cucumber on a little game called Riverbond. I'm also a solo game developer. I've made games called Bombing Graffiti Sandbox, Lofty Quest, and a handful of other stuff. I have my BA in game design from Sheridan College in Canada, and I'm a hobby graffiti artist for fun on the side. So I want to posit a question to you, the viewer. What exactly is level design? Now, there's no audience I could actively interact with here, so just kind of think about it and think about what your answer to this question would be. I'll give you a couple seconds. All right. So here's how I like to define level design. I define it loosely as the arrangement of elements in a space to achieve a target experience for a user. Now, this is a very broad definition, obviously you can tell, but I think it's the one that kind of works best for how I think level design is applied to games. And traditionally, we perceive level design as an element of kind of first-person action combat-y games or games with more sort of action focus, but I think this definition is less rigid and more flexible for its application to level design as a wider medium. And on that note, I'm going to play a game with you, the viewer that I can't interact with because this is a video. I'm going to show you some things, and in your head, you're just going to think whether or not this game has level design according to our definition. Remember, that definition is the arrangement of elements in a space to achieve a target experience for a user. So we'll go through some of these, and I'll give you a couple seconds on each to kind of think about whether or not level design is applicable to this, this example. So, first example, Halo. Does Halo have level design? Yes, I would argue Halo does have level design, and a very traditional application of it too, right? We have cover placement, power-ups, pathways, spawn points, all these different kind of spatial elements that come together to create an action shooter experience with encounters and very spatial context tied to it. So yeah, Halo has level design. Woo! Next example now, Animal Crossing. Does Animal Crossing have level design? Yes, I would argue Animal Crossing does have level design. Not only through the game itself, so the islands are all procedurally generated. They have consistent rules that are applied in a rule-based way to create opportunities for player interest in terms of building and modifying that island. And you could argue that in some ways, players themselves are also acting as level designers in these space because they create perceived experiences for the villagers on the island, right? So the level designer is them, and the user for that space is the villagers that live there. So absolutely it does. Or Candy Crush. Does Candy Crush have level design? Yes, I would argue Candy Crush does have level design. Now, an interesting distinction here is that level design, a game might have a level design, but it might not necessarily have level designers or people whose entire job it is to explicitly be a level designer for it. They might call it something as a different name, like a puzzle design. So a puzzle designer might be working for King Games, but they are doing level design in a sense. The candy containers are spatial elements. The puzzle is informed by the spatial relation of these objects. Power-up placements come into play when considering, it's almost like you're building a little puzzle that is an encounter in a sense, if you were to compare it to a traditional first-person action game. Things like obstacle usage, you're putting all these spatial elements together to create that desired experience for a player, which is typically, ascending challenge that gets harder over time. So yeah, I would argue that this does have level design. What about like traditional wrestling? Does this depiction or any depiction of wrestling as a concept have level design? Yes, I would say it definitely does. For example, for a wrestling ring, somebody put thought and intention behind the elements of it, right? Behind all these spatial elements. So they put the circle, even if it's just like a sand pit and a circle, the circle is a certain size, right? So somebody had to look at the size of the circle and say, this isn't big enough for these wrestlers to properly use this space or to have a fair fight. So we're going to make it this size. We're going to make it a circle because that makes it most even for all wrestlers. And since it's a very organically flowing thing, the circle as a shape makes sense. And even considering the other users, right? The viewers are users as well. So there's, in this example here, you can see there's ropes put up, which is a type of level design for the experience of the user who is not actually wrestling, but just observing the wrestling happening. So wrestling is like one of the oldest sports because it's just two people wrestling each other. So I think this is interesting, right? Because it takes a lot of what we know as modern level design principles and applies it to play from a very, very old sport, a very, very old game. So even way back when people started wrestling in like the BC era, somebody still had to think about these rules and apply them spatially to this space. So it's definitely level design, and it's not one that we often think of either. What about the Grand Mosque in Kuwait? What about a mosque or a religious site? Does it have level design? Yes, I would say that it does. Architecture is sort of a form of real world application of level design principles. Obviously, there's kind of different considerations a lot of the time, but for architecture, the same things are just as important as what are important to level designers in a digital space or a play space. The intention is, like for this mosque as an example, you probably want to put emotions and feelings of the users. You want to invoke those emotions in this space. So you probably want to inspire, generate some kind of fervor, promote introspection, give a sense of community. There's a lot of, I guess, experiences that architects try to build when they build buildings. And so it's also applied in the real world in a similar way. And theme parks are kind of a great intersection also of where architecture meets play design, because you're still building things that have to exist for certain reasons, but you're also building them in a way that is fun and engaging and kind of promotes play in a user. So a lot of the same principles and the same sort of mindset apply to architecture as applied to level design. So an important distinction also when we're learning about level design is that level design is not level art. This is often something that there's a little bit of confusion about between these two rules, especially for people who are first learning about level design as a concept. So level designers are mostly focused on spatial play experience, what it's like to actually go through a space, what it's like to move around it, what it's like to experience that space, and especially as it relates to kind of more gameplay oriented things, whereas level artists are mostly concerned with aesthetics of the space, how the space presents itself to the user, how visually pleasing or readable it is. There's also definitely overlap between these roles. So a level designer also cares about how readable a space is and also cares that it looks good at the end of the day. But usually a level designer, when they're thinking about a space, is more thinking about what it's like to experience that space, whereas level artists are thinking about what that space visually looks like, generally. But these two roles definitely work together to create spaces. We'll get more into that later. So Also depends on the studio a little bit. Some small teams might only have a level designer who also does level art. So there's a lot of overlap here, but don't confuse the two because there's a big difference between a space that is made by a level designer to be gameplay oriented and playable in that way in terms of experience, and a space that looks pretty, but the gameplay might not necessarily be the primary focus. So what does a level designer actually do then? In a way, I kind of describe it as virtual architecture if architects kind of had to also build the building too. So we design spaces for a targeted gameplay experience, kind of like a mosque. You know, we're deciding what we want the user to experience from that space and how, and we put those elements together to try to create that experience in the world, the digital world. We also design, script, and implement spatial gameplay content in Engine. So we create content in those spaces too. A lot of the time, we'll be creating like encounters if you like fight something in a space, if you have to solve a puzzle in a space, if you have to like view a space from a certain angle. We try to make sure that these things kind of come together in such a way that we're meeting our goals. We also collaborate with other disciplines to accomplish this, since level designers can't really do all this alone. It's like saying, you know, you're going to make all the content in the entire game by yourself. It's like, well, all right, but we probably need sound designers and artists and narrative designers to really help bring our intended experience to life, because we definitely cannot do that work by ourselves. There's also a lot of sub-specializations, so it's not always clear-cut. You're just making the level. As I mentioned before, level designers can get involved in level art as well. Here's some very like specific sub-specializations that I know of from my experience, but there's also a lot more out there. So this is by no means a definitive list, but just to kind of show you how level design can kind of be broken up into specializations. So like mission designer. Usually they're focused on creating levels with cohesion to a quest or a mission in a game, very narrative focused, integrating like story moments, focused gameplay, something that's pretty linear typically, or something that is very specific to kind of teach you more about the world or have some kind of narrative wrapper to everything. Encounter designers are a little more, at least in the way that I know them, are a little more abstract, focused on designing specific encounters, typically ones that are reusable in other spaces. So they'll build an encounter that is appropriate to one space, and then maybe another LD can use that encounter in a different space. And so they're typically more focused on gameplay moments and like combat. They might build generative gameplay opportunities to integrate into a wider world, possibly even procedural generation, but it really depends on what the project or the studio is. An open world designer is kind of, as you can imagine, focused on designing for an open world, as opposed to something that's more like mission or quest, where you're really focused on maybe a handful of characters and very specific narrative moments. Open world is typically more open and more focused on just kind of the fun gameplay of the wider scope of things. And technical level designer. As you can guess, it's more technical. It often typically they act as a supporting role for level design team, creating things like tools, systems, prefabs, helping kind of establish and smooth out the workflow of the rest of the LD team, and sort of bridging the gap between programming and technical requirements and level design. So they're a very, very valuable support role to have on your team. So that's kind of an overview of level design as a discipline and like sub-specializations. Now I'm going to walk you through the process of designing a level in a studio from start to finish. Every studio does it differently. This is the most common and effective approach, I guess, that I've seen at most studios that I've experienced with. So take that with a grain of salt. I'm not speaking for every studio, but this is usually what I've seen work. So initially, when you're making a level, you start with a concept. Usually you'll receive like a set of ideas, mechanics, story elements from direction outlining what they want the level to accomplish. So it might be something like, oh, we really need a level that's focused around water, or oh, we need a level that really highlights this enemy. We want to introduce this one enemy, or something to that effect. Basically, you'll get kind of the super high level intentions for what direction wants from it. and then they'll kind of hand it off to you, and you'll have a field day building it for them. So typically we start super high level with flowcharts and really rough sketches. This is mostly just to hash out the general idea and help yourself understand what you're building. Because if you're given something that's like, we want to introduce an enemy, that can mean anything to you. So you want to kind of get down to brass tacks and figure out the most effective way to establish kind of a flow and a spatial relation to this goal. And the key here is really starting high level and starting really rough. And basically, the more flexible you are at the beginning, it allows you to make major changes quickly and easily and not be tied down to any one idea at the start. So, if you're building like a flowchart, or if you're building just a very rough sketch of a level, means you don't have to build it in Engine right away. It means that instead of moving things around in Engine and having to do all that work, you can just erase a couple lines on a page and say, okay, I'm going to try something else. So the key here is really start high level, really make sure that your intentions are coming through and that this design makes sense to you and possibly anybody else you show it to at this stage. Because once you've figured out your concept and kind of outlined what you want to build, then you got to pitch it. So once you've come up with that concept, you need to establish kind of the idea and the intentions of that level with the wider team. You want to communicate those intentions and gather feedback from elements you may not have considered. So if you are building a thing that a level that is introducing an enemy, maybe somebody, if you run it by them, will say, hey, that enemy doesn't actually work like this, so what you're imagining won't work. And then you can take that feedback and iterate on it. Typically, once the rest of the team has seen the concept and knows what they need to do to help build it, also, you'll get a sign off from somebody, so a director possibly, or just the rest of the team themselves. Once everybody knows what's going on with the level and kind of you communicate those intentions to them, then you can move on to the next stage after pitching, which is Greybox / Greyblock / Whitebox. This has a million different names depending on the studio. It doesn't matter too much. It's essentially just prototyping. It's the initial phase of building out a level. So you can see kind of the image here from Robert Yang that it's kind of a bare minimal application of very basic primitive shapes. So like cubes, spheres, capsules. You're basically just building the layout of the gameplay space in Engine and working at a high level to focus as much as possible on the core gameplay experience. You're going to hear me say this a lot, but you really want to prioritize function over form and figure out how little detail you can get away with while still communicating the intentions that the space is supposed to have. So this is where you can start implementing your basic gameplay, find layouts, flows, and organizations of your space that feel fun and meet your pitch and your initial concept. It's okay also to change that initial concept a little bit as you go. Obviously not so much that you're like, say we're building the space for one enemy, that you're just throwing out the enemy and building something else entirely. You still want to meet your original intentions, but if the original drawing and the original concepts that you've created don't actually meet those intentions when you get into 3D space, and that will happen because no good plan survives contact with the enemy. So if you find out that once you're actually building in the space that it's not working, you're free to kind of tweak it and rejig it a little bit to meet those intentions again. And you want to gather feedback from the team as you work in this phase to improve your work and end up with a design that works best for your goals. So yeah, basically the gray block is where you're building these layouts, building out this very basic gameplay in a way that isn't aesthetically pleasing. You're not worried about getting into details of like where a table goes or what a wall should look like. You just care that there's a wall there and that there's a table there. It doesn't matter what they are. It just matters that how it's interpreted to a player in the space and how it ties into the gameplay. Because once you're done this, and really as a part of this, you're going to be collaborating a lot. This doesn't necessarily come after the gray block. It will definitely also come as a part of it too. But you definitely need to be working with other teams to help you achieve some of these goals. So even as you're doing a gray block, you might be working with level artists to kind of beautify the space, audio designers to work in sound events, game designers to make sure your mechanics are integrated sensibly. So this is a really ongoing process throughout the entire development cycle. It mostly comes in when you move past Greyblock, but it is also equally applicable to Greyblock itself. So as you're doing this stage, just as the previous stage, you want to be prioritizing that function over the form, you know? It's okay to have stuff that looks aesthetically pleasing. Obviously, you want your level artists to be able to create beautiful environments out of the levels that you've designed, but your intention needs to remain clear through all of this. So as you build out these spaces, you need to make sure that you're still going back to your original intentions. You're kind of, I guess, making sure that as other people touch this and as other people get their hands on it and start to work in what they've been working on, that those intentions are still met throughout the cycle. Then, once all of that has been put together, I made it seem really short. This can take months or years depending on the level that you're working on. So I apologize that this is only like 5 minutes long, when really in practice it's so much more. Once you're done this though, you're bug fixing. Once your level is more or less as cohesive as you can make it with the other disciplines and your intentions are still remaining clear, you go through and you kill bugs. Little polished things like, oh, there's some missing geo, or oh, these enemies aren't working properly, or oh, this event doesn't trigger the way it's supposed to. And depending on the project, this can be an extensive workload. I've been on projects where this has been like 6 months to a year, depending on the level. But, you know, it's a necessary thing to do before you ship it. So this is going to be you after your level's finished. You'll look that relaxed. Yeah. Once you've fixed your bugs, once you've collaborated, your level's all done. And that's the end of the cycle. And then you repeat it. And then you go do another level somewhere else. And then just keep doing that forever and ever and ever. Ta-da! Yeah, so that's a basic overview of the level design process from start to finish. Obviously, it's a lot more nuance in there, but that's the general overhead. So now, how do you think in level design? This is kind of the tricky part, because it's one thing to design a level, but it's another thing to be able to kind of remind yourself or know how to go about addressing concerns or focusing on certain things in your level. So how do you do that? The big thing that helps me as a level designer is to empathize with the player. Because remember, everything you're building is focused on the player and their current perception, knowledge, or skill level. So asking yourself questions like, what would a player think at this point in time? How would someone new to this game see the space? What does or doesn't the player know as they're navigating this? As a level designer, you have a lot more knowledge on the space that you're building than a first-time player will. So the better you can put yourself in the shoes of a player who has not really experienced the space before, the better your design will come out in the end, because then you're able to understand what is going through that player's mind versus having your all-encompassing level designer who has worked on this for 6 months knowledge. So the more you can do this, the more successfully you'll meet your target experience a lot of the time. So another thing also is to start simple and obvious and then add your complexity on. It's very tempting, especially for beginner level designers, to get an idea and rush into making it as elaborate and cool as possible. This includes stuff like really complex gameplay interactions, or like cool events that play off, like explosions in the distance and planes flying overhead or something. Or even just like making a certain space very aesthetically pleasing. It's really tempting to get in there and trying to make your vision come to life immediately. Ultimately, this tends to be a waste of work. And usually if you have to iterate and you have to redo things based on feedback, or if you haven't validated your ideas first, it's just going to make more work for you. So the simpler that you can start out and then spend time later to make it more elaborate, the easier you're going to make it for yourself without having to waste work. And I think in my experience, this is something that happens. This is something that people learn through experiencing it, where once you throw a bunch of stuff out, you're like, well, I shouldn't do that again, because now I just have to redo it all. But it's a very valuable lesson and a good way to kind of think about things as you design. Another thing to consider is I mentioned this before, but prioritize function over form. Something might look cool, but things that look cool aren't always intuitive or useful for creating a cohesive experience for the player. So something might look very awesome, but not be readable at all, or not be easy to understand from a player perspective. So you want to make sure that the intention of your gameplay is met through all the changes that you make, and that if something proves to be too complex or too kind of convoluted, you just want to really go back to the drawing board and refocus on the simplest version of that. Water. Now I want to just, we've gone through the interesting stuff. I want to just go through some terminology to be able to kind of speak as a level designer, or understand, I guess, level design terms that are important. Just kind of wrap your head around the initial knowledge bump of getting into level design. So metrics. Metrics are units of measurement that pertain to interactions or events in your game. This can relate to player movement or AI or any other gameplay elements. They're usually defined in partnership with game design or art teams. So something like a vaultable ledge should be 0.5 meter, an easy jump is 5 meters, difficult jumps 8.5 meters, a bare explosive thing should only be this large. These are really constant reference points that help you define the spaces you build. Since we're building in virtual worlds and for different systems every time, it's very hard to, it can be tricky to know your metrics off the bat. So you want to spend some time establishing these and working with them as you work on your levels. Landmarks. Landmarks act, these are also called vistas and weenies. I think weenies is a like Disney parkitecture terminology thing. Landmarks are a visual grounding point to help the player orient themselves in a space. A water fountain in a plaza, a bell tower in the distance, a mountain in the really far distance. These can all be used as landmarks. It's basically just a feature that a player can look at and go, oh, I remember that was here when I was there, so now I know where I am in relation to it. Really helps kind of, especially if you have more complex spaces, really helps the player understand where they are or where they're oriented. Vantage points, locations which allow you to get a better view of an area. These can be useful in pretty much any kind of game, any place where a player might, if a player can see an area before they move through it, they're going to be more comfortable. It's like why you go into a store for a second time, you're more comfortable than the first time, because you've never gone in the first time. You're going in blind, and that's kind of intimidating. But if you saw the store beforehand, you know, okay, I'm more comfortable going in now. Verticality is basically just the concept of vertical elements, which encourage more multi-dimensional gameplay or movement. Typically we're used to moving on the horizontal plane, so a lot of the time we have to actually put extra effort into making areas feel more vertical if your movement supports that. And it just helps a space feel more dynamic when you integrate more verticality. Ingredients. An ingredient is just anything you can use to generate gameplay in your levels. So like player jumping, explosive objects, NPC archetypes, hazards, things like that. Pretty much it's kind of a vague term, but I've heard it used a lot, and it really confused me when I started, so it's definitely worth remembering that. Ingredients are just kind of game concepts or things you can use to create gameplay. Readability is how easy a player can understand the information being presented to them. So something like a big green door with a big exit sign and a light pointing on it would be more readable than an exit that has that's like a small unassuming brown window in a wall, right? And that's for a bunch of reasons, but mainly because a player can look at it and go, oh, I can read the intention for that, and I can understand what it's wanting me to do just based on how it's being presented. Feedback is kind of a very loaded term, but typically when we refer to feedback, it's a signal that helps the player understand an in-game event. So it can mean something that a player does or something that the world does in response to the player. So as an example, in Candy Crush, you get a power up and the screen plays a cool particle effect. That's some affirming feedback for the player, like, you did a good thing, good job. In The Legend of Zelda, a shadow appears to warn the player that an enemy is dropping from above. That's feedback from the world saying, like, hey, like, warning the player so that they can react appropriately, and it's not just kind of caught off guard or blindsided by what happens next. Progression. So in the level design context, progression refers to how a space changes over time. So if a player enters a room with a skylight and then they can climb a wall to pull a switch and the skylight opens, that's the level progressing as a result of the player's action. Or even just the player moving through a space, that's them progressing through it. Directionality, it's kind of like verticality in the previous slide, but directionality is basically how something is oriented, typically as it relates to the player. So a space that might lack directionality is kind of hallway-like, or very sort of, I guess like one note, doesn't feel all that dynamic, whereas something that has a strong directionality might guide you very clearly while also having a little bit of complexity that doesn't disorient you. Visual language is how information about gameplay or space is communicated visually. So it's kind of similar to readability, or really assists in readability. It's usually defined in collaboration with art teams, where, like with the big green door example, the visual language maybe for exit doors is that they're big and green. And so by consistently having every exit door be big and green, the player can very quickly understand, okay, the big green thing means exit. Kind of like how every explosive barrel in video games are red. It's not typically because, we can't think of a better color to make explosive barrels. It's because that's a common language that has been established, not even just in one game, but just in a bunch of different genres of games, to say, hey, this is explosive, or this is dangerous. So it's just an understood video game cultural language at this point. All right, final slide for terminology. We're almost through it. Flow is really kind of pertaining how a player moves from one space to another in a level. It can also be like a logical flow of events. So if you go from mission beat A to mission beat B to mission beat C, that's kind of establishing the flow. Or if you move from the laundry room to the hallway to the bedroom, like that would be a logical flow through a level. So flow can get kind of weird if you start off in the laundry room and then you go into a bathroom and then you go into a kitchen and then you go into a attic. Like that doesn't flow well because it doesn't feel like they're all elements that kind of relate to each other appropriately. So the flow might be kind of disrupted. That's kind of flow. Pacing is how quickly the events of a level unfold. So faster pacing might have quicker transitions between encounters and environments, whereas slower pacing might have environments or events that are more slow to proceed. Typically, games want to balance pacing, kind of have ramps of pacing that kind of fluctuate a little bit, because if something is constantly slow, then it could potentially be too slow. If it's constantly fast, it might be too overwhelming. And that kind of ties into intensity as well, where it's kind of a question of term meaning how demanding gameplay is on a player, just mentally or emotionally. How stressing is this for a player to engage with? High intensity might be too taxing mentally and emotionally, which means the player would get kind of burnt out on the game pretty quick. Lower intensity might not be challenging enough and could mean that the player might not have enough interest. So most games aim to have a mix of all these intensities blended together and kind of mixing them so that the player isn't getting too bored all the time, but also has breaks from the higher intensity stuff to make sure that they can still take what's the word I'm looking for? The player can still process the game and still have fun with it, yeah. That's it for the terminology, all the dry stuff out of the way. But hopefully those are helpful for you to just kind of understand how to speak like a level designer and how to integrate those kind of thoughts into the concepts and levels that you build. So to summarize, level design can be described by me as the arrangement of elements in a space to achieve a target experience for a user. A level designer is essentially a spatial experience architect. We're kind of like architects who also build the world itself, usually in a digital context. Level design does not equal level art, although they have similar priorities at times. Typically, a level designer is more focused on the play experience, whereas the level artist is more focused on the aesthetics of the space itself. Practice to excel at level design. Try to practicing empathizing with the player's experience. Take yourself out of your own level designer shoes and put yourself into a player's shoes who might not understand anything at a given moment. Be comfortable collaborating with other disciplines and learn to take feedback and iterate based on what other people think about your work. Keep it simple and small and layer complexity and keep that function over form. So make sure that at the end of the day, you're making sure your level and the intentions of what you want to achieve in terms of gameplay, in terms of the play space, are still being met even when you start layering on the more beautiful aesthetic stuff. And whenever you can, try to keep it simple and then make it more complex once you know it works. Validate your designs before moving forward. Q&A. If I were presenting to a live audience right now, this is where I would ask questions or have questions asked. That's how Q&As work. People ask me questions. But I'm not right now, so I don't have any questions. But if you feel inclined, please feel free to leave a comment below. Ask a question, and I will respond to it in a timely manner. You can also come at me at Twitter or LinkedIn if you have any other thoughts, feelings, questions, or just want to keep tabs. Yeah, thank you very much for checking out this introduction to level design, and I hope that you learned a lot. Bye-bye.